A blonde girl is forced to drink a liquid. The bottle rolls on the ground. Suddenly, a woman with red hair tells Radiana that it will be an honor for her to die in her place. Radiana realizes that her voice won't come out. Maybe it's the effect of the poison they gave her. Seeing her crying, the woman says she needs to smile when she meets the son of the great sun. Radiana is perplexed as the maids paint her hair red. The woman takes her painted hair and says that with this color, no one will distinguish them, and she never thought she would be thankful that her father impregnated that woman. She leaves, thanking Radiana and saying it was a pleasure to meet her. The girl, unable to express herself, is taken away by force. She questions what to do since she can't control her body. She continues crying, thinking she doesn't want to die. But soon she faces a coliseum full of people celebrating. A woman proclaims that as she swore to the gods, today she will offer her first daughter, Gracia Mundos, as a sacrifice to the Sun Prince. She stares at the protagonist, who can't say anything. Lamenting for her poor daughter while proceeding with the ceremony, the protagonist, in fear, can't say that she is not Gracia but Radiana. However, she finds herself tied up, and as the fire spreads, she begs for someone to save her. Meanwhile, in the sacred temple in the east of the empire, someone complains that Gino is bothering him and asks if he forgot that he can read minds. The loyal servant Gino asks His Highness to forgive him and informs him that the Sun Festival is approaching and he must not miss it. With a goblet in hand, Oratio Lumen, the third son of the sun god, seems calm and smiles, informing that he could kill Gino at any moment, who responds that even being able to regenerate, it is still painful. The prince doesn't care about Gino while worrying about how many bottles he has already drunk. The solar eclipse is imminent, and the festival will soon take place, where the subjects offer a sacrifice to each of the 3 sons of the Sun King. This sacrifice being a human woman. A prophecy by Povius says that one day a prince will find a human woman immune to fire, and thus they will give birth to a powerful deity. Because of this nonsensical prophecy, the princes had to endure the screams of the humans as they burned to death. The prince thinks he never imagined that humans could suffer so much and that he never asked for such a sacrifice. Gino tries to convince the prince to attend the sacrifice while fearing for his own life. The prince stands up and says that if his father wishes, he will attend just this once, and sends Gino to inform his father that this will be the first and last time. Gino asks to go along while the prince disappears. At the ceremony, the flames continue to burn the protagonist. Reading the thoughts of the people, the prince discovers that Gracia is the girl's name. As the flames consumed her, people notice the presence of the Sun Prince, telling everyone to salute him. The prince thinks he should have arrived after the sacrifice was complete. He approaches the girl, pushing the flames away, and says that Gracia must have some divine power since she hasn't died yet, but unfortunately, he wasn't interested in accepting the sacrifice. The protagonist cries, saying she is not her. Confused, the prince asks what she said. Radiana curses him, saying she is not Gracia. Enraged, Gino questions why the prince brought the sacrifice to the sacred palace. Calmly eating, the prince says he prefers to keep her alive because he needs to check something. But the servant doesn't understand why he should waste his divine power on a human and that what he did would be a crime. Sarcastically, Oratio asks if he will be punished. The servant fears, saying it is only a possibility. No one in all existence would dare to judge Oratio, for he is the sole judge of the sacred palace, including his own father, the Sun King. Gino goes to the girl, who is already turning to ashes from being so burned, and begins to use his sacred power, healing the burns. Even the color of the protagonist's hair returns to normal. Radiana is now completely healed and breathing. After finishing the task, Gino says it will take some time for her to wake up and reminds His Highness to check what he needs and get rid of her. The prince stares at the protagonist while she remains unconscious, but is interrupted by an announcement of the arrival of a messenger from the imperial palace. Irritated for hating complications, he knows he must keep her hidden. The messenger arrives, saying he brought gifts from the queen, who is happy to have seen the prince participate in the festival. Enraged, Oratio questions the messenger while surrounding him with a blue flame. Fearing for his life, the messenger emphasizes he was sent by the queen and that this is tradition. But the prince remains furious and questions if the messenger wants this to be his last day alive. The messenger begins to burn and asks the maids to leave while he falls to the ground. Gino, worried that His Highness expelled everyone, knows that the imperial family won't let this go unnoticed. However, the prince, not caring, says he always wanted to live a life without the imperial family's interventions. The servant agrees with the prince and says that now that he attended the Sun Festival, he should take the opportunity to finally enjoy himself. Horatio, irritated by the servant's words, sends him away and tells him to only notify him when the girl wakes up. Meanwhile, Radiana is lying down, suffering from a nightmare. In it, she suffered constant abuse, trying to escape after being beaten so much. The woman with red hair questions if these were all the children they could find, but the man makes a point of showing the fugitive they caught. Radiana hides her mark while praying to the sun god to save her. She was confined in a tower where she only ate and slept, and the servants wondered why Gracia brought so many poor women to this place. While brushing her hair, the protagonist feels sorry for Gracia because she knows she will soon be the sacrifice for the sun god. Even though she was so kind as to rescue her, Saint Gracia is responsible for keeping the sacred fire alive with her divine powers. In the morning, Radiana thanks the sun god for allowing her to have such a peaceful life. A maid enters her room to take her to the high priest, but warns that they will need to change her hair color first. The protagonist, not understanding anything, just accepts and follows the maids. Seeing herself in the mirror, Radiana notices how much she looks like Saint Gracia, but feels embarrassed for thinking such a thing. Upon arriving at the place, the maid presents her to the high priest as Saint Gracia. Surprised, the man asks what the saint would like to talk to him about. The protagonist trembles, not knowing what to say, and apologizes, but she is soon interrupted by the real Gracia announcing her arrival. Radiana promptly bows to the saint, and the high priest seems surprised by their resemblance. Laughing at the situation, Gracia says she searched everywhere for this girl and asks if this isn't perfect to the man. She grabs the protagonist's arm, showing the mark on her wrist, and adds that her mother was right. The Mundos family's seal along with the cursed writing was engraved on the illegitimate child. A memory of a woman with her child comes to the priest, and he believes he should have killed them both when he had the chance. Nervous, he assures Gracia that it was a mistake that only happened once. She ignores him and asks Radiana if she doesn't see the resemblance, saying that her mother was a priestess of the sun god. While the protagonist trembles, trying to understand the situation, the woman continues, saying that the priestess was known for her blonde hair and charm that attracted any man. In a specific dialect, the high priest responds to Gracia to stop this madness and that her life is at risk. Gracia replies in the same dialect, saying that the protagonist will replace her in the Sun Festival tomorrow. Understanding everything, the protagonist begins to fear for her life because she knows that on the sacrificial altar, a human is offered to the sun god. She tearfully pleads for mercy, but the villain is impressed that Radiana knows the old Eladian dialect and asserts that she was born to die in Gracia's place. Still suffering from this entire nightmare, the protagonist cries while begging to be spared. She grabs the prince's clothes as he watches her curiously. Horatio takes Radiana's hand and pulls her to him, thinking that even though she is a mere human, she has pale skin and golden hair that looks like gold. The protagonist, still tearful, begins to wake up and feels as if her hand is burning. She opens her eyes and blinks a few times, struggling to see a radiant man, and asks who he is. Without responding, the prince stares at her and, with his powers, creates a goblet with a golden liquid. He presses the goblet to Radiana's lips. She quickly remembers the purple liquid, becoming frightened because she had already been forced to drink poison. Biting her lips and slapping the prince's hand away, Horatio insists, asking her to drink the liquid or the sunlight will dehydrate her to death. He creates a new goblet and tries again to offer it to her, but she keeps refusing, until she spills the liquid all over her clothes and hair. The prince, also stained by the liquid, says that her stubbornness was cute at first, but is now irritating him. He then places the liquid in his mouth, approaches her, and kisses her, holding her face. She ends up drinking the liquid, and finally manages to see the prince better and all his beauty. Blushing, she asks his name, but she is surprised when he says he is disappointed that she doesn't know who he is. Horatio smiles and introduces himself as the guy she cursed at the festival. Radiana is confused, but soon remembers that she cursed him as soon as he appeared while she was burning. Finally, she realizes she is still alive and he affirms that she is not dead, but also cannot say she is alive. The protagonist realizes the mistake she made, knowing that those who curse the sun god suffer his wrath for 3 generations. She steps back, trembling at the consequences, not even sure if she will live to see her 3rd generation. Radiana then bows to the prince and pleads for him to forgive her sins and show some mercy. Crying, she continues asking the god to bless her and save her from this eternal hell. Horatio asks her to stop, lifts her from the ground, and places her on the bed. With all the pressure from the events, Radiana faints while crying. The prince is impressed, thinking that the only reason the descendants of the sun govern humans is to be worshipped by them. To the prince, Radiana was the only human to look him in the eyes so directly. Gently, the prince caresses her face, thinking that he cannot read her mind, and therefore it would be a waste to kill her now. He then leaves the room and asks the maid to keep an eye on the protagonist to prevent her from causing a scene again. Also, to make sure to treat her with respect because he cares about her life for now. The next morning at the Tesca Palace, Gino finds Radiana still in bed, not believing she is still alive. But he is soon interrupted by the prince, who asks the servant to keep quiet because he intends to keep her alive, which makes Gino question the danger of others finding her. Horatio mocks the situation, questioning if it wasn't Gino who said before that he should lose his virginity. Confused, Gino asks if His Highness wants to lie with a sacrifice, and the prince says yes. But laughing, he assures the servant that he is just joking, and Gino continues to question when His Highness will get rid of the human. And even if the king allows her to stay, the queen would never let the prince get away with it. Horatio becomes thoughtful and says that the servant is right. Finally, Gino relaxes, thinking the prince understood the situation. But the prince interrupts, saying he will lie with the human right now. The servant covers his ears and says he will pretend he heard nothing. Horatio responds that the servant's insolence is impressive and asks if he wants to end up like the others. Gino protests, saying His Highness is too cruel. The prince concludes by saying that no one will know if he doesn't tell. Even so, the servant questions how long His Highness intends to keep the human and reminds him that his situation is very different from his brother's. Horatio's black hair and eyes showed that he was the son of a human, but demigods were never recognized as real gods, even if they were of the highest divinity. Most were assassinated or poisoned in the name of divine retribution. But Horatio not only survived, but also ruled as an imperial prince because, due to his natural talent, the other gods feared him. Returning to his discussion with the servant, the prince says that everyone in the family wanted him to lose his virginity. But the servant quickly retorts that they didn't want it to be with a human and that it could affect Horatio's position in the palace. Unconcerned with the situation, the prince asks what if it happens. Gino cannot believe what he is hearing. To be recognized as a prince upon coming of age, princes would have to marry another noble or a nymph and consummate the marriage. The Cincerum, who supported the queen, even made a list of potential brides to control Horatio, but he preferred to give up the throne and give his virginity to a mortal. Thoughtful, the servant realizes that even if the prince loses his virginity to a human, since he is the judge of the heavens, the sun god cannot take his title. But still, it doesn't seem right for him to lose his virginity to a mortal. Tired, Horatio simply says he wishes they would stop bothering him. However, Gino continues to worry about the chance of His Highness being banished from the heavens. Pouring a golden liquid into his goblet, the prince says that is exactly what he wants. Radiana begins to wake up and can smell the warm sun. She wonders if all this was a dream or if the sun god had mercy and took her to heaven. But looking at her hands, she realizes they are tied. The prince, sitting beside her, asks if her name is not Gracia, then what is it? And she, still scared, responds that it is Radiana. He repeats her name, and she blushes upon hearing it. Continuing, he asks her to call him Horatio. Realizing the situation, Radiana begs not to be killed and for His Highness to release her. He unties her hands and tells her she must promise not to faint again. Rising quickly, the protagonist bows to the god, but he asks her to raise her head and look at him. Blushing, she gathers the courage to face him, and he is pleased that she is a good girl and says that eyes are made to meet. Seeing the prince's smiling face, Radiana realizes how handsome he is. Content with what he sees, the prince agrees to let her live, and she can hardly believe it. He confirms it, saying he could even make her immortal, but they must first sleep together. Radiana freezes at the prince's words, but questions the possibility of not wanting to be immortal. The prince simply responds that she is brave to dare to refuse the offer. The protagonist becomes nervous, but he stands up and says it's okay. As he disappears, he asks her to rest and focus on getting better because she is as weak as a mouse. Radiana, now alone in the room, remembers her mother's words about men being like animals and that she must protect her innocence at all costs. Nervous about the situation, she realizes that even though he is a god, he is still a man. His words may seem sweet, but he could turn her into stone or wood if he is not satisfied. She cries as she remembers her mother, but is interrupted by a strong smell of flowers. And from a drop of water, a mysterious girl appears in the room, startling the protagonist, who ends up with her scream echoing throughout the palace. The girl with green hair introduces herself as Nico, a lower water nymph with 19 younger siblings. For her, it was an honor to serve the first guest of Prince Horatio, but there was a problem. The protagonist refused to eat or drink. Nico worried because mortals do not survive long in the celestial palace due to their fragile bodies and have difficulty enduring the sun's essence. She tries to explain to the protagonist that she needs to at least drink the water, because the water contains the essence of the third sun prince. Even not fully understanding why His Highness gave this water to a human, Nico knows that this sacred water is considered a very valuable item among the nymphs of Tuska. Radiana asks what will happen as she drinks the water, and the nymph responds that she will become beautiful and healthy like a goddess. Realizing the value of the water, the protagonist offers Nico to drink it in her place, but the nymph refuses because it was an order from His Highness. Finally, she decides to accept and drink the water. The nymph asks if she will eat tomorrow, but Radiana already refuses and then asks if she will continue at least drinking the water, and Radiana agrees. Nico thanks the protagonist and says she forgot something. She arranges the protagonist's hair with beautiful flowers. She announces that she is now ready to join the prince in his bed, and that orange flowers are used by the women of the heavens while preparing for their wedding night, making Radiana choke on the water. The palace floor is covered in blood as servants drag what appear to be bodies. But Horatio seems unshaken, witnessing this scene. Nico appears to notify His Highness that Radiana drank the water, but is interrupted before finishing the sentence by the prince, who asks her to leave if she is only reporting this. The human woman who piqued Horatio's interest refused to eat for several days, accepting only the divine water. And if it weren't for Gino's abilities, she probably would be dead. His Highness notices that Gino is hiding and orders him to appear. Gino quickly steps out of his hiding place and says he was just passing by. Sarcastically, Horatio questions why the servant appeared only after he had carried out the punishments. The servant asks if he really intends to keep the human alive. While serving the prince, he continues saying he believes it is not a good idea to give the golden water containing his essence to a mortal. The prince looks at his golden water, then looks seriously at Gino, who, fearing for his life, begs for His Highness's mercy. But the prince ignores him and says that the human girl was able to look him in the eye. Not understanding, Gino says that it doesn't matter what she did, they just need to get rid of her. But before finishing his thought, he questions if she really looked into the prince's eyes and how her soul remained intact. Horatio says that this is precisely why he is interested in her and needs her alive. Like a golden wind, His Highness disappears, leaving Gino and the fallen goblet on the floor. Radiana, walking through the palace, wonders why she asked him to spare her and that she cannot stand the smell of oranges. Nico is not present, and the other servants ignore her, so this would be her only chance. She stares at the precipice, and while crying, she realizes how high it is and why she is afraid. Does she still want to live? When her life was full of difficulties, the protagonist liked to look at the radiant sun. It gave her strength to believe she could live a normal life someday. But reality was always different from her desires. If there was any hypocrite, it would be herself for not being able to give up that miserable life. As she jumped to her death, Radiana thought it would be better to die than to have hopes for something that would never happen. Horatio quickly appears and catches Radiana in his arms. While still in the air, he warns her that even if she breaks her whole body from the fall, he would bring her back to life. He places her back on her bed, and while offering her a fruit, says she should keep in mind that resurrection is a painful process. Accepting the fruit, Radiana trembles, realizing she cannot even decide about her own death, and she can no longer make choices for herself. The prince, raising his hand, says he knows it's happened, while the water nymph was absent, and with just a wave of his hand, he beheads the servant who is in the room. Looking at Radiana while smiling, he asks her to eat her fruit so that the same thing doesn't happen to Nico. From that day on, the protagonist was under stricter supervision, and every morning she swallowed the food and water the nymph offered her. This way, Radiana managed to recover her health again, and the prince visited her frequently. And whenever this happened, Nico would transform into water and disappear out of fear. The protagonist endured Horatio's smiles and small talks until bedtime. However, the prince seemed satisfied with these interactions at night. For 2 centuries, he had deprived himself of contact with others because of his cursed blessing that took the soul of those who looked into his eyes. Radiana was afraid, but unlike the others, she kept her soul intact. Since Horatio couldn't read her mind, he experienced peace for the first time. He allowed her to cry sometimes, and even if she tried to end her own life, he would revive her or perhaps even make her immortal. But there was a problem, which was her lack of vigor. The prince asked the protagonist to go rest, and Radiana agreed. She lay on the bed, thinking she needed to sleep even if she didn't want to. But she was curious about why the prince kept her alive. Still a bit dizzy from just sleeping and eating, Radiana was getting tired of this. Nico was promptly waiting to serve the protagonist with food and the golden water and informed her that the prince had gone hunting. In recent days, Horatio was obsessed with increasing Radiana's sleep hours. He believed this will increase the time she could survive in the heavens. But this made Radiana increasingly sleepy, and only the sacred water made her feel better. Feeling dizzy, she asks Nico if there is anything to do in the palace. The nymph asks if she would like to dance or sing together. But Radiana wanted to do some work like cleaning or organizing something because she could no longer stand the boredom. She knew she would go crazy, but Nico still wouldn't allow her to do those things because imperial women didn't do that. Even though the protagonist didn't have noble blood, the nymph explained that because she was His Highness's companion, she was practically part of the imperial family. But before finishing the sentence, Nico is startled and quickly disappears in her water form. Horatio appears on the balcony, happy to see Radiana awake. Not knowing how to express herself, the protagonist tries to smile to please him. He then approaches and asks if something is bothering her. She says no, but he insists and says he hates liars. Radiana hesitates for a moment, but ends up telling the truth about having no work to do and asks him to give her some task. She adds that she is skilled and that if he gave her some papyrus, she could make a basket or a box. While caressing her hair, the prince finds the protagonist's words interesting, but he says she doesn't need papyrus or to work. After all, he's providing everything she needs, so she just needs to stay quiet. Radiana realizes that sometimes Horatio looked at her with a crazy look full of pity and cruelty. Just stay quiet like a beautiful statue and wait for me. That's all you need to do. The prince, while looking at his panther, tells Radiana that she is like them and doesn't need a purpose in life. She belonged to him, and that's why he was her reason for existing. On a rainy day, the prince seemed irritated, sitting on his throne. Gino wondered why he looked so unhappy, even while doing everything as he wished. Meanwhile, Nico was organizing the papyri in a corner of the palace when the servant questioned her about the human. Startled by the sudden voice, she responded that Miss Radiana was well, and Gino was confused about how a human could be so well in the heavenly palace. Nico then confirmed that perhaps Miss Radiana wasn't that well, and he then asked what was making her sad. Before she could respond, she was interrupted by the prince appearing behind her. Afraid to respond, Nico froze, and Gino told the prince not to scare them like that. The prince stared at the nymph and asked if she didn't value her life, and she, not understanding much but scared, replied that she didn't know what he was referring to. Horatio questioned how she dared to absorb Rhinum in his presence to prevent him from reading her thoughts. Rhinum is a mental defense created through sulfur, gold, and magic to prevent mind reading. Fearful, the nymph responded that she had no choice and did it so His Highness wouldn't worry about Miss Radiana. However, the prince became more enraged with her response and questioned why he would be worried. Nico and Gino were paralyzed with fear of what Horatio might do. He pondered whether or not to kill her, but worried about how the protagonist would react if that happened. Now he understood why he had been irritated in recent days. Horatio created a dark blue flame in his hand and approached Nico, who, hypnotized, let the prince hear all her true thoughts. She felt sorry for Miss Radiana and was afraid the protagonist might try to jump off the balcony again. She saw Miss Radiana force herself to eat every day and often end up vomiting. Radiana was a prisoner who couldn't even leave the palace because she was being heavily watched. Nico wanted to help, but feared what the prince might do to her family and ended up just watching while Radiana smiled despite her fear. At the end of her thoughts, the nymph fainted, and the prince finally understood what was happening. Chino, still confused, asked if the reason for the storm was because the human had irritated his highness. But Horatio only responded by telling the servant to erase Nico's memories and get more papyri. Seeing the sufficient amount of papyri, the servant asked if his highness would need more, and the prince responded that he wanted to see the human's room filled with papyri. The servant questioned why the prince seemed so obsessed with the human and mentioned that his family was asking if he had lost his virginity yet. Horatio then told Gino to visit the imperial palace tomorrow to show proof that the prince had finally slept with someone. The next morning, Radiana was in her room, while the maid stood motionless, watching her. This made the protagonist think that one day she might end up like them, without any expression, practically dead. She had fought against hunger her whole life, fought for a drop of water, surviving only on weeds. But she found it strange that even with a comfortable bed and delicious food, she still sought reasons to stay alive. Without realizing it, she spoke the word freedom out loud, and that's when she realized she didn't just want to live, she wanted freedom. But she cried, thinking that this was something a slave would never have. Her mother had given her false hopes by saying that one day Radiana would be free and could experience everything in life like a light in the darkness. While crying, the protagonist realized how wrong her mother was. A voice and several papyri interrupted her suffering, and Nico appeared in the middle of all the papyri, happy to bring something for Miss Radiana. Radiana worried that the nymph had brought all this without permission, but the prince appeared beside her, affirming that he had given permission. She was touched by the gesture, and he asked if this wasn't what she wanted. Horatio sat beside the protagonist, extending his hand to her. Radiana felt embarrassed and grateful for the gesture, even though he had said before that she had no use for the papyri, but she still took the prince's hand. He led her to the center of the room where the items were, and she was impressed by the amount of papyri they had brought. She wondered why he had requested so much. The prince interrupted her thoughts by calling her and asking if she liked the gift. Embarrassed, Radiana looked at the prince and he, smiling, waited eagerly for her response. But the protagonist couldn't comprehend his intentions or how she should react. She let go of his hand and thanked him with a bow while glancing discreetly to see if she had done the right thing. The prince only stared at her while frowning, and Radiana became nervous, wondering what she should have said. He places his hand on her face and asks her to smile. He adds that to show she is grateful, she should smile. Emotionally moved by the gesture, Radiana tries to smile forcibly. But it seems that this does not satisfy Horatio. He then asks her if she really wants to live, and trembling, she responds that of course, she would like to continue living. Sarcastically, he adds that people who usually want to live beg for their lives. Radiana quickly kneels before the prince, placing her hand and forehead on the ground while begging him to end her life. Entertained by the situation, Horatio asks if she really wants to die, but the protagonist cannot answer and only trembles with fear. He lifts her by the arm, lays her down on the papyri, and while caressing her hair, affirms that he cares a lot about manners because, after all, he is the Sun Prince. Effortlessly, he undoes the braids in the protagonist's hair, who is lying there still not understanding much. However, she gathers the courage to question the prince's intentions and says that she believes he is much kinder than he appears. He laughs while listening to her praise him, but asks her not to test his patience by asking him to kill her, as he will do something more traumatic than death. Unless she begs for her life, and if she does, he will do his best to keep her alive, so she can be his woman for eternity. Horatio says he can see that she had no intention of dying because she is trying to understand and navigate the situation. He then kisses her on the papyri. Their fingers interlock, and Radiana holds him by the shoulder during the kiss. They both part from the kiss with a gasp to catch their breath. Her face turns completely red as she breathes rapidly after the kiss. Horatio teases her, asking if she was tired after just a simple kiss. But her mind was a mess, wondering what had just happened while her heart raced. The prince moves away from her face, satisfied with that kiss, and hopes that she becomes stronger to understand him, until she is surprised by a small cry of pain when he bites the tip of her thumb and blood drips onto the white cloth. Horatio tells a maid to inform Gino to take the blood-stained cloth to his father's palace, and then kisses the back of Radiana's hand, asking her to rest. With a breeze, he disappears before her eyes, leaving her alone lying on the parterre. Radiana was still blushing because she realized the servants had been watching the whole time, and possibly Nico had also seen everything. She didn't even know what to say to face her after that. Nico suddenly appears, whimpering out of the water and apologizing to Radiana because the prince had appeared suddenly. But the protagonist was relieved because she had not witnessed anything that had happened on the parterre. In the Celestial Palace, Gino was nervous because he always knew that day would come at some point. He announced at the palace gates that he was present and saluted the Sun Lumen by presenting himself on behalf of Prince Horatio Lumen and humbly asked for an audience. The gates opened, and many people inside the bright white palace saw Gino and two other maids enter. They walked through the people towards the throne where King Lumen was present. Gino bowed before him and greeted him a second time, closing his eyes, and Lumen responded, expecting good news from his report. The anticipation made the servant nervous, and he glanced at the other people around. Lumen quickly understood the source of his stress and gestured for several curtains to cover the area so they could talk privately. The king asked who the girl was with a serious expression, and Gino, still nervous, said she was human. A strong silence spread in that enclosed space with the breeze coming from outside. The son of the sun tapped his fingers on the arm of the throne, visibly annoyed, and asked if Horatio had generally brought back his human sacrifice. He proceeded to ask if she was at least a priestess with special abilities, because she might be the one described in the legends. Gino was confused for a moment before trying to explain as best as he could, gesticulating with his hands, affirming that she was not the person from the legends, as she was a priestess with minimal powers. He also nervously asked the king if he wasn't suggesting that Horatio was planning a rebellion or something similar. Lumen affirmed that Horatio was still valuable to him despite his insolence. Then he ordered Gino to transform Radiana and ensure everyone saw her as a courtesan of the imperial palace, which shocked the servant because it seemed like a totally unexpected order. But Lumen insisted because Horatio would certainly show up at court soon and then retreat to Tesca. Gino mentions that many believe the human girl was from the imperial palace during her stay, which makes the king gesture with his finger, retorting that they could dispose of her when the prince loses interest. The movement of his finger caused the chest the maid was carrying to float towards the king so that he could seal it with his powers. Lumen had no intention of starting a war with his third son. A week passes at the Tesca Palace, and the protagonist wakes up in her room, sitting up in bed slowly, still a bit sleepy. That's when Nico appears with tears of relief in her eyes because she was so worried the whole time. Nico tells her she has been sleeping for an entire week, and Radiana smiles, saying she feels well. Looking at her arm, she is surprised to see her skin is clean and new instead of scarred from her time as a slave. Radiana touches her own arm and feels that her skin is also softer than usual. She remembers that the prince told her to make a choice, but she never had the chance to truly choose. She questions why they kept her alive, as it seemed Horatio was showing her mercy. Radiana calls for Nico and hesitates before smiling and asking for something to eat. This makes Nico emotional, and she covers her face with her hands, agreeing to get food right away. Meanwhile, Radiana gets up to stretch and immediately feels a strange, pleasant sensation. She was completely renewed after receiving Horatio's kiss. Radiana smiles and tells Nico that she wasn't a priestess, but a slave in the past before coming here. The slave seal was proof that she was at the bottom of the social layers, but it disappeared with just a kiss. Everything made it feel so transient that even Radiana felt a bit lost. Nico asks her not to say such things because her life was far from transient. After all, unless she was an entity, everyone in the imperial castle lived as equals, which meant her past was important here. Radiana turns to Nico, surprised to hear her comforting words. Hearing that regardless of what others think, Horatio still chose her as his woman, which means everyone should treat her with the proper respect, and to Nico herself, she was important because she was the first person she served. Hearing that Radiana was special to Nico made her start crying with a smile of happiness. She had never experienced such warmth before, and it was enough to dissolve the cage she had been trapped in for so long. Radiana was determined to think and act better from then on, and looked at the sun with that strength, until she heard Horatio's words again in her ear, as if he were beside her, saying she should strengthen herself to understand him. Looking back, Radiana sees nothing and only feels the wind blowing against her clothes and face. If her life depended on Prince Horatio anyway, she decided she would do what the entity had asked of her. Radiana hurries away from the window to the papyri and asks Nico for a knife with a stick. Later, Horatio and a shocked Gino were gathered in the place where all the papyri were cut and shaped into baskets. Nico was kneeling and turned towards them in surprise at their presence before quickly standing up to greet them. The prince asks what is going on, and Nico explains that she was helping Radiana trim the papyrus leaves. Radiana herself continues with her back to them, working on her task while Nico continues speaking. She says that Radiana has been weaving baskets since she woke up, and despite being asked to rest, she refused. Horatio interrupts, saying that Radiana is wasting the little energy she has on that frivolous project, which prompts an exaggerated reaction from Gino, who shouts that the place is a mess and it's impossible to turn such a human into a sophisticated lady. In a swift motion, the prince silences Gino with the papyrus before approaching Radiana. He calls her name, and the girl turns to him, radiant upon seeing him, which impresses the prince because she welcomed him. Horatio says it is indeed him, and she agrees that she sees that very well. Radiana affirms that he is the third son of the great sun who values good manners above all and smiles in his direction. She holds a basket in her hands and says she has been working on her task just as was asked. This confuses him, and Radiana explains that she was told she had nimble hands and could make sturdy items. His face softens a bit when she says that she was ordered to do everything she could for Horatio. The prince extends his hand to her and suggests that he could take a look at what she was working on. Radiana hands the basket to him before he can lift it to inspect it. Horatio extends his hand again and this time asks to see her hands. Radiana does as he says, and he comments on how her hands are stained green from the papyrus. His smile makes Radiana blush, and Nico nervously intervenes to say that something was wrong with Gino, who was still with his mouth covered in the corner. The prince abruptly lets go of the protagonist's hand just as Gino removes the leaf from his mouth, coughing and saying he thought he was going to suffocate. He throws himself on the ground and starts rolling around dramatically, holding his head and complaining about the whole mess. Radiana smiles at the scene and says it was kind of Gino to create a breeze for them since it would help the papyrus dry faster. Nico gets nervous knowing that wasn't Gino's intention, but still thanks him. The servant is outraged and shouts that it's no time to be wasting time making baskets. Radiana retorts that they do need to make them because it was the prince's orders and places a basket on her head. Gino tells her to put the baskets down at least for a moment. That's when Radiana responds that her name is Radiana and Gino shouldn't keep calling her woman all the time, which impresses Horatio with her assertiveness. Gino approaches the prince to ask what was going on with Radiana's head because after all, she had been asleep for a week and was acting like this. Horatio is thoughtful, looking at the girl after hearing the servant's whispers. His silence is his confirmation, as the woman who begged for death had transformed before his eyes and suddenly became obsessed with making papyrus baskets. Still, he realizes Radiana is much happier than before and can only stare at her for a moment. The protagonist stammers, asking if he had another task for her and promises to do her best. This makes Gino click his tongue and cross his arms, asking if she can play any instruments. Radiana visibly doesn't seem to know, and the servant continues asking if she can recite poetry, sing, or dance. As she remains silent, the servant slaps his forehead and wonders if there's anything in the world she can do. She proudly holds up a basket and says she can weave these papyrus baskets, which only makes Gino explode in anger again, while the prince remains calmer than ever beside him. He then hands Radiana some scrolls for her to memorize the written contents and stop making those silly baskets. Later, Gino is still frustrated, pacing back and forth because Radiana seemed useless and incapable of doing anything right. Horatio reveals that she was a slave in the past, and the servant is shocked and suggests it would be a good idea to visit Lord Magus. The prince reminds him that it was necessary to ascend a treacherous mountain to reach Magus and hoped Gino didn't want to endanger a weak human like that. This makes Gino respond that they had no choice since the Imperial Festival was a month away. He states he would rather climb that mountain than be struck by lightning when they find out the prince lay with a human. Horatio ponders that they would be receiving some guests from the Imperial Palace the next day and would be sending more traitors for judgment. The prince orders Gino to leave early in the morning as they need to prevent them from discovering the human scent on Radiana when they arrive. So, the next morning, Radiana left for the first time and was quite excited for her first outing outside the palace. The carriage makes its way and stops until they reach Mount Kor, not far from Teska. Gino explains that they would need to do the rest of the journey on foot due to the difficult path for the carriage. The three disembark to walk up the mountain, but Radiana soon notices that both Nico and Gino are quickly getting exhausted. The servant mentions that he should have asked the prince to create a cloud carriage for them as well. The comment makes Radiana remember that Horatio visited her that morning, and she recalls what happened that night. She was sleeping deeply when a hand approached her face, but she remained asleep despite being aware. Radiana wonders about the reason for the visit and then tries to get Gino's attention, who was irritated as usual, but even more so because he was tired. She steps in front of the servant and bends down with her back to him, saying he could climb on her back because she would carry him. Gino is shocked and complains that he is too old for that kind of treatment, but still ends up accepting the offer, making an exception, which makes Radiana laugh. They continue their climb up the mountain as the day passes, and Gino, on Radiana's back, points out that they are close to their destination. He jumps off her back when she bends down to release his weight and runs ahead. Nico approaches and says that Radiana did a good deed, which makes her proud despite sweating a bit from the exertion. Radiana loves the place they are visiting because she can feel the sound of the forest and the breeze on her skin. But Gino interrupts their monologue, waving in the distance for them to hurry, and Nico responds that they are coming. She puffs out her cheeks, complaining about how Gino acts like a grumpy old man sometimes. Radiana asks Gino's age out of curiosity, but Nico isn't sure, though she knows he must be at least 500 years old, which surprises her. The two girls walk up the windy mountain behind Gino, and Radiana brushes her hair from her face when she sees a centaur stopping ahead, a man with long brown hair and a beard. The centaur says he thought Prince Horatio had chosen a nymph of Aphrodite when he heard he had chosen his first partner, not a mere human. Gino confirms that this is exactly what he, Lord Magus a centaur, is seeing now, and continues by saying that fortunately, Radiana is smarter than she looks, and that she is also making papyrus baskets. Magus stamps his hooves on the ground and suggests Radiana take care because she wouldn't want to be eaten alive, which scares Nico and makes her hide behind the protagonist. Gino asks if the Lord had any idea that the prince intended to lose his virginity to that young human, and he responds that he was just joking a bit with them and that it's fine as long as they stay by his side. They continue walking up the mountain while Gino complains that it wasn't funny at all. Nico remains hidden behind Radiana as they walk until they reach the entrance of a cave. They enter and look around in awe because everything inside the cave is shining like jewels. There are boxes and many other things inside as they all enter the space. Magus mentions that they must be hungry and approaches the guests with a plate of meat and some cups with drinks. After offering the food, he says he needs to get back to work and steps away a bit. Radiana and the others sit on the ground to eat, and she mentions that the Lord is very kind. Gino scoffs at the compliment, saying that even after they worked so hard to visit him, he offered too little for the guests. Nico says she heard that Magus is the wisest of all men and has never seen so many scrolls in her life, which makes the servant scoff again at the compliments, saying it has been a long time since he perfected that feeling himself. Radiana laughs at the conversation, and Gino asks why she is having so much fun. She responds that it's because Gino is being a bit adorable now, talking like that. The compliment catches Gino off guard, and he turns red before asking what exactly she means. Nico teases Gino, saying he looks as red as a cherry. As the conversation continues, Radiana looks up when something catches her attention. What she sees is a messy table full of items and study objects. She mentions that the Lord seems to have been very busy recently, and Gino agrees, saying it seems to be the case while still drinking from his cup. He says that despite Magus being eccentric and rude, he is certainly the wisest student of all Povius. The Lord seems too busy to focus on the visitors, and Gino suggests they leave to rest while he is away. Nico protests the suggestion, saying Magus certainly wouldn't want them to spend the night in that place. Radiana assures her it's fine, though there is still something she would like to do before lying down. So she crouches down to work on something with her hands. Meanwhile, Horatio is in front of one of the men who betrayed the Empress, and the traitor is on his knees with guards around him. The prince recognizes him as Pericles, his mentor and the father of an old friend. He raises his right hand, seeing it clean and without any bloodstains, and laughs softly before looking up at the skies. Returning to Radiana, she was quietly asleep when the prince appeared beside her and lay down with her. He wondered if she had trouble, looking into his eyes like everyone else. Horatio embraced her in her sleep and rested his face on her chest, wishing that for just a moment he could rest in her arms. Back at the Imperial Garden, a meal shared by several beautiful women under the sun was presented. Among the women was Empress Avaricia Lumen, a direct descendant of the goddess Hera. One of the women mentioned she had heard that the third prince had finally lost his virginity and laughed. Another woman agreed with another laugh and wondered what kind of divine bloodline was being associated with the prince. They expected that surely the Empress knew, which made her laugh. Avaricia questioned what was important about whether she was descended from an entity, as Horatio would marry the woman they chose for him. And she turned her gaze to Terra with a regretful look that made the Empress's knees shiver in her chair. Terra suggested that the Empress see for herself at the Imperial Festival, as the most important part was discovering how the third prince felt. Avaricia raised her goblet and declared that everyone should join her, and so all at the table mimicked her, raising their goblets. The Empress said that they should all bless Horatio's first woman, who was the jewel of the Povius Empire. Then Avaricia lowered her goblet and stood up from the table, still smiling, before leaving the table accompanied by her niece. In the Empress's temple, the two women climbed the stairs until Terra threw her crown away, making it hit the floor. She complained that she was outraged that the prince chose someone who wasn't a nymph from the Pyros family and lost his virginity to a nobody. The Empress reprimanded her in a way that made Terra tremble in place while she was still walking before sitting on a sofa with the goblet in hand. Avaricia assured that Horatio would marry Terra and that there was no doubt about it. At the moment, Horatio was the loyal dog of Sol, and the Empress would do everything to make the prince her nieces. She stated this with conviction and confidence in her voice, swirling her drink in the goblet. Meanwhile, in the cave at the Lord's house, Nico was nervously pacing back and forth. Her worry was because Radiana was burning with fever, and she could only blame Gino for that carelessness. She was sick because she had to carry him all the way up the mountain. But the servant complained that he never asked her to do any of that, despite being equally worried. That's when Megas appeared to find out the reason for so much commotion in that place. Nico asked the Lord to come closer, and he placed his hand on Radiana's forehead, soon stating that she was exhausted. He suggested giving her a generous hibiscus tea with cinnamon and assured she would be well quickly. Megas guaranteed this to Nico, who was worried, and said he would go out to make the tea as there should be some herbs nearby. Suddenly, he raised his voice in surprise upon looking to the side and seeing all his chests and tables completely tidy and shining like new. He set that aside and focused on making the hibiscus tea, mentioning that Radiana must have been born under Venus's blessing, and that they could start the lessons as soon as the clever young lady recovered from her exhaustion. After serving the tea and with the rain falling outside, it didn't take long for the protagonist to wake up. Radiana noticed it was raining by the sound coming from outside, and Nico quickly asked how she was feeling, relieved that her fever had improved significantly. The protagonist asked where the prince was, and Nico replied that he was at the palace and reminded her that they were visiting Lord Magus' cave. This left Radiana confused because she was sure she felt Horatio's presence while she slept the previous day. The thought made her blush and wonder if it was all just a dream. She sat up and asked where Gino was, and Nico complained that no one should care about that old man, until Gino himself appeared, grumbling if she wanted something bad to have happened to him. He approached to hand Radiana some herbs that confused her. He explained that he got some of her favorite papyri since she had asked for a mountain of them before. Nico asked why he had brought that because an apple would have been much better than a bunch of papyri. That's when Megas' voice appeared, asking if Radiana was still sleeping, and Nico remembered something she had to do. She took the protagonist's hand and said that the Lord had something to show her, then guided her to where the centaur was. Their attention is directly drawn to Magus's manual work, transforming fine, sharp silver into a silver bowl. It was an impressive scene, even for Radiana, who was practically open-mouthed. Noticing their arrival, the Lord asks if the protagonist would like to give it a try as well, and she is surprised by the suggestion. Gino complains that he had asked Magus to help her become a refined lady, not a blacksmith. The Lord ignores the complaints and tells Radiana to do the same, intending to have her be seen as a descendant of Circe, so that everyone would notice that she learns to create metallic bowls and could do it entirely on her own. The servant didn't seem very convinced because Circe was the goddess of stone, and this complaint made Nico sulk as there was nothing wrong with liking stones. Then Magus tells Radiana to follow his lead, and she agrees before taking the silver he offered her. The two begin weaving the silver together, and she manages to create a silver flower that impresses both Nico and Gino with its beauty. The Lord agrees that it is indeed a grace and touches the protagonist's shoulder proudly upon seeing her work. He mentions that Horatio visited the previous night, which is why he wanted to strive not to disappoint the third prince. Radiana freezes because, in the end, her intuition that the prince had been there was true and not just a dream. A few days pass inside Magus's cave, and the rainstorm continues outside. On that day, Radiana is at the cave's entrance, touching the raindrops with her hand, with Gino by her side, who comments that the rain didn't seem like it would stop anytime soon. The two are hooded in black cloaks and hear Magus respond that it would be difficult for them to descend the mountain in that rain. He is carrying a box full of sun-dried amber stones and hands it to them, saying it would keep them warm. The three hold a stone each inside their hoods, and the Lord advises Radiana not to let anyone take advantage of her, and to try to act with a bit more aggression as they had discussed earlier. Those were Magus's final pieces of advice with a smile to the protagonist. The trio then leaves the Lord's cave to descend the mountain with their hoods covering their heads to protect them from the rain. Gino wonders why the prince seemed so depressed when they knew they would be returning that day. Radiana is surprised to hear this, and the servant quickly mentions they should be careful because the road was slippery. But the protagonist's mind is distracted, wondering what the prince's emotions could have to do with the rainy weather. A mere human like her would never have the capacity to understand the gods, but still, Radiana wished to know more about Horatio, especially to understand why she was being kept alive. That's when a purple lightning bolt flashed in the sky, making Nico scream in fright and cover her ears. Gino sighs because the prince really didn't know when to stop and hurries his steps to descend even faster, which surprises the girls. They also hurry to keep up with Gino as the rain continues to fall on the mountains. At the Tesca Palace, the rain was also falling out of sync when the trio managed to return home. The servant instructs Nico to take Radiana to the tower because he would be going to talk to the third prince and find out what happened. He quickly disappears before the girls can enter the tower and remove their hoods to climb the stairs. The protagonist looks out the window and is surprised because she didn't know she could see Horatio's temple from there. But what catches her attention is also a powerful light coming from the temple, and Radiana asks Nico what could be happening. She responds that she couldn't say because perhaps they could only see the light due to the walls being made of stone. Nico suggests they should go up to rest because it was something everyone saw during rainy days, and the protagonist didn't need to worry too much about it now. Meanwhile, Gino ran to the temple and was shocked to see blood spread everywhere, wondering how many traitors had died there. He shouts for Horatio to find out where he was and then grabs one of the men by the collar, shaking him and asking where the third prince was, until he finally finds the prince lying down and runs towards him, desperately shouting his name. Gino makes a symbol with his hands above Horatio, and he opens his eyes shortly after feeling his servant arrive. The prince hears Gino say that at this rate, he would end up at the Empress's mercy and suggests that he should at least go out to meet the first prince. He had tears in his eyes as he said that the first prince was of pure blood and could help them in some way. But Horatio retorts that he couldn't help them at all, with an exhausted expression on his face. He explains that on that day, there was no trial, and he simply ended the lives of all those men without a second thought. So when they get the chance, they should kill him, now that Horatio was just a murderer. Crying, Gino responds that he was nothing of the sort and that he was only the all-powerful judge of Povius. He points to the side and states that Horatio should see his brother Saltus right now and hurry if he wants to see the crescent moon. Horatio laughs at his servant's words and then disappears from his sight. Gino crouches down, still crying, and wonders in a trembling voice why they keep disturbing the third prince that way. After all he wanted was a quiet and peaceful life instead of anything else. Meanwhile, Radiana tested passing her hand through the rain and noticed there was a protective barrier keeping them dry despite the ongoing rain. Nico offers a cup of tea and explains that it was part of the magic of the Teska Palace. The protagonist turns to the girl and asks if she doesn't intend to go home as it's getting late. She responds that it was still raining heavily outside, and Gino also asked her to stay with Radiana until the rain stopped. Radiana extends her hands to hold a saucer of the teacup and asks what would happen if the prince decided to visit, considering Nico was afraid of him. She replies that she knew Horatio wouldn't appear for now, which makes the protagonist reflective. She sips her tea while thinking about it and feels a bit nervous, clutching the fabric of her dress. Nico leaves the room, saying she would be nearby if Radiana needed her, wishing her a good night. The protagonist bids her farewell with a smile before her expression turns pensive. The rain continues to fall, and Radiana knows it's a sign that Horatio must be in a bad mood. She wonders if something happened in the temple for him to be like this, especially since Gino ran off scared and worried about the prince. Radiana didn't know when it started, but she couldn't stop thinking about Horatio. Whether it was the warmth of his touch and the electric sensation of their kiss in the past or the weight of his body over hers. She places the cup on the saucer and feels her face burning just by remembering those sensations. The protagonist walks to the window and touches the barrier, hoping the prince might return soon to see her. Meanwhile, at Prince Soltis Lumen's palace in Lanichua, the first Prince Soltis is present. He is sitting in his chair peacefully, doing his nightly reading under the moonlight when darkness begins to form behind him. Soltis turns his attention to what appeared behind him without changing his expression and realizes it was Horatio. He asks why his brother always appears like a ghost instead of speaking to greet him properly, until Horatio's figure appears with several drops of water dripping from him, and Soltis hesitates for a moment, observing his brother before asking how many lives he took this time. Wary, the third prince admits that he lost his judgment this time, with a hint of exhaustion in his eyes. Soltis stands and walks to his brother, mentioning that it hasn't even been 3 months since the last mass execution, and he has already stained his hands again. He asks if his brother is going mad and holds his wrist, but Horatio remains silent with a slight smile. Soltis supposes it is Empress Avaricia's doing and states that he would need more than just a wash to rid himself of that blood, and that he would request more purified water from Lanichua while water still drips from the prince's wet hair. Horatio wonders if things would improve that way because even Soltis's powers wouldn't work on him. His hands were too stained with blood to be cleaned. He closes his eyes to reflect and then remembers Radiana. Remembering her makes him open his eyes with a clearer vision of things. Horatio feels like a fool for involving a human woman in such a situation. That's when Soltis reprimands him because, despite being a judge, he is still the Sun Prince and holds a large, shining silver goblet in his arms. The prince scolds his younger brother, saying the sons of the sun couldn't take the lives of the innocent, and if that continues, Horatio would have his powers taken and his essence would slowly fade away. Unless he wants to live like Hades in the underworld forever, Soltis advises him to take care of himself, and he comments that he heard he lost his virginity and asks from which family the girl came. Soltis sighs and comments that at first he thought Horatio had allied with the Empress, but that was something the third prince never intended to let happen. The elder asserts that he should accept Avaricia's proposal and consider his next moves later, prioritizing his survival now. Horatio closes his eyes and responds that the Empress wouldn't save him. Instead, his family would gain even more power with the royal family. He asks Soltis if he wants Caligo to succeed to the throne, making him reflect for a moment without answering. Horatio continues, saying that if Caligo ascends to the throne, there would be no need for war, but Povius would still fall into ruin. He states this while opening his eyes and standing up to face his older brother with conviction in his words. Soltis says he is content ruling Lanichua, and that going against their father's words would be considered treason. Therefore, Horatio shouldn't waste time trying to support him and should focus on taking care of himself now. The younger brother smiles peacefully, saying he would gladly rebel against their father. The next morning, Radiana woke up to someone shouting outside, saying she wouldn't believe what they brought for her. She quickly sits up in bed in surprise and sees Gino saying he brought everything on Mega's list so she could start practicing. There were tools, silver, and fire to heat and allow Radiana to continue training in making silver bowls. She asks if the prince really gave permission for this, and Gino responds that since she was useless in any area of the arts, she should at least be able to do manual work. Then he calls for Nico, who appears immediately and says she should read poems to Radiana while she works. He hands the maid several scrolls and explains that in 15 days, Radiana would be participating in the Crescent Moon Festival as a nymph. The protagonist is surprised because she is human, and Gino explains that she should pretend to be a nymph since humans weren't allowed there. If anyone discovered the truth, she would die immediately with a lightning bolt to the head. Radiana thinks this is even more serious than it seems and asks what comes next. The question confuses Gino, and she clarifies by asking what happens after she tricks everyone into thinking she is a nymph. The servant remains silent for a moment before telling her that the prince would marry the woman his family chose, and she would be free. Gino couldn't tell her the truth that Radiana might be burned to ashes when everything ends. That's when the protagonist suddenly grabs Gino's hand, surprising him, and asks if he is really telling the truth. He asks what she means by that, and Radiana mentions freedom and if it would really happen. He pulls his hand away from hers and covers his mouth to clear his throat, reaffirming that she would possibly be set free, because the third prince wouldn't need her for anything anymore. The protagonist becomes enthusiastic and responds that she would try her best and start her training right away to meet expectations. And so, 10 days pass at the Teska Palace while Radiana continues working to perfect her manual skills. Nico, with a tired look, asks if the protagonist has managed to memorize all the poems after hearing them so many times. The protagonist agrees because she thinks she can remember at least 20 scrolls. The maid asks back if Radiana could recite them if she has memorized them, and so the protagonist starts to recite one of the poems with a smile. During her recital, Nico gets scared and disappears from the room, leaving the protagonist alone. Or so it seemed until suddenly, someone started to complete her poem, and Radiana turned in surprise to see Prince Orecio's presence in the room. Radiana's heart begins to beat rapidly in her chest when she exchanges glances with the prince. Orecio asks if she decided to become a blacksmith poet, working and reciting at the same time. He approaches from behind her and sees the silver flower she created, commenting that she is much more skilled than he thought. Then he touches the back of her hand to have her show her palms, saying she shouldn't work to the point of hurting herself. Noticing the girl's fingers were red and had some wounds from working so much, Orecio guides her hand to his own face and advises her to be more careful while doing the manual work. Radiana does nothing to stop his approach or his other hand touching her waist. She had forgotten that he could hide his scent and his oppressive presence and worries he might take all her tools. So the protagonist says that the tools didn't cause any real injuries and that she would be more careful from now on. After all, she was doing everything for the sake of the third prince. Orecio stepped back from her and then sat down, telling her she could continue. This confused her, but he assured her he would stay silent and not interfere. She tried to retort, but then remembered she couldn't let the prince think she wanted to live. Radiana turned back to her work, and meanwhile, Orecio recalled revealing to Saltus that he would rebel against their father. He leaned back in his seat and looked at the ceiling, thinking that despite saying that, he couldn't even be bothered to do anything about it. Moreover, the third prince had barely been able to stop thinking about the protagonist from the beginning and wondered if it was because Radiana's presence made him feel at peace. Or perhaps it was her grass-stained fingers, or the way she always wiped her mouth after eating and chewing a peach. Maybe it was the honey scent of her skin during sleep. There were so many small details that Orecio remembered about Radiana that when he recalled them, his chaotic mind calmed down. Meanwhile, Radiana continued working with the silver and thought she would like to have the courage to ask the prince why the days had been rainy and why he seemed so exhausted, but she couldn't imagine how someone like her could have such thoughts. This made her remember when Nico said that to marry, the sons of the sun must lose their virginity as a ritual, and that it had been some time since the Empress and the Pyros family had been eyeing the third prince. Radiana also remembers Horatio telling her to get stronger to understand him, which makes her blush a bit. She didn't know why she was chosen, but she considered that maybe that night something might happen. Her distraction with all those thoughts ends up causing the protagonist to accidentally burn the back of her hand. Radiana pulls her hand back with a small cry of pain and steps away from the forge. Horatio immediately interrupts and calls her by name, which freezes her in fear, unsure of his reaction. The prince orders her to come closer, and Radiana turns around, assuring him she is fine, despite stammering. She claims it was just a small, silly injury. But Horatio insists, saying he can smell the scent of burned flesh from there and wants her to come closer. Radiana has no choice but to follow his orders and walks to the prince. Horatio takes her hand and comments that it's indeed a painful wound. He leans down to kiss the back of her hand on the injury, but something suddenly catches his attention. There is a strange presence of hooded people flying through the night air, and it seems the royalty is sending them. Horatio's hand moves up to Radiana's wrist as he thinks this is a terrible time for this to happen. They would end up discovering that Radiana is human thanks to the smell of burned flesh emanating from her body. But the protagonist is unaware of all this and confused about what he is thinking. Horatio decides to make her use her breath to disguise the smell and then suggests they could finish what they started last time. The prince's smile makes Radiana's heart beat faster, and her face turns red again, surprised that he wanted to continue things right there. He gently pulls her onto his lap and carries her like a bride in his arms. Commenting that Radiana's face is completely red, he jokes that maybe the forge's fire is a bit too hot for her delicate skin. The protagonist feels nervous before responding that it's not exactly that and hesitates before finishing her sentence. Then Horatio himself leans in to kiss her cheek. The prince's hand slides to hold and press Radiana's hand, intertwining their fingers. The prince wonders what he should do now because, contrary to what he said, he doesn't think Radiana is ready to understand him. He ends up freezing while exchanging glances with her and is surprised when he touches her hair at the moment she asks if there's something he doesn't like. Radiana asserts that she will do anything he asks of her because she is worried that otherwise Pino and Nico might be in great danger. Horatio doesn't know exactly what is going through her mind. But before he can finish his sentence, Radiana asserts that she understands everything and that he must want her to start by kissing him. The prince falls silent at her response and smiles a bit. Then he leans in and calls her a good girl, hoping she won't regret that decision. That's when Radiana surprises Horatio by skillfully undoing her braids. It was a sign for Horatio to lean in to kiss her as she asked, and so he does, leaning in her direction. To ensure you don't miss the unfolding of this romance, give a gentle tap on the notification bell, and I see you on the next tale.